Christian fight the faith-based fight to take back America? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And I want to talk about the importance of those of faith getting involved in politics and the successes that many in the Christian community, that many in the faith-based community have had in recent times because they've done just that. And before I get into that, I want to mention that you can get Bold and Blunt at one of the best platforms online for faith-based podcasts. It's called Edify. Edify.app. Go there, find Bold and Blunt among the lineup, download it, listen to it, and subscribe to other podcasts on this great lineup, on this great Edify app. You can also get Bold and Blunt, of course, at WashingtonTimes.com and wherever other podcasts are offered. Christian conservatives shatter turnout records for Trump. That was a December 2nd, 2020 piece written by Tony Perkins at frc.org. That is Family Research Council. You're familiar with the organization, of course. And it's significant. This piece is significant because it showed just what the faith-based community can accomplish in the political realm if the faith-based community actually gets out and votes. Let me read from this piece. No one could have predicted the twists and turns of this election, right? This 2020 election. But Donald Trump was certainly right about one thing. His deeply religious base was going to rewrite the record books. Back in January, Tony Perkins writes, talking to a group of evangelicals, he, meaning Trump, predicted that as high as their turnout was in 2016, Christian conservatives would blow those numbers away in 2020. And that was a direct quote. And then Tony Perkins goes on to write, and boy, did they. 4 years ago, researcher George Barna would be the first to tell you that he never thought he'd see a stronger statistic. And then he goes on to use this acronym, SAGE CONS, which he describes as spiritually active, governance-engaged conservatives. There's a mouthful. Spiritually active, governance-engaged conservatives. SAGE CONS. Nearly maxed out their turnouts at the polls. 91% of them, driven by their dislike of Hillary Clinton, showed up to vote, shattering every record ever set. And here's the quote from George Barna. We thought, well, we're never going to see that again in our lifetimes. You really can't get much higher than that in terms of turnout. Now, Tony Perkins continues, he was wrong and couldn't be happier about it. In 2020, the election, that same segment of voters showed up in, quote, staggering, mind-blowing numbers, George Barna said. A whopping 99% of SAGE CONS turned out to vote. No one else, George Barna said, even came close. And one more quote from this piece from Tony Perkins. They cast 23 million votes, a third of Trump's total. That's what makes that so impressive, Barna explained. They only make up 9% of the population, and yet this 9% of motivated Christians accounted for 14% of the total vote. That is powerful. That is huge. And that is what America needs more of right now. Right now in the midterm elections that are coming up, right now in the next presidential election that is on the horizon, and right now going into the foreseeable future. Christians, evangelicals, faith-based voters, however you want to characterize them, cannot afford to sit idly by and allow the political world to be run by those outside the faith-based community because as the culture goes, so goes the politics. If we have a culture that is deep in the mud, which we do now in America, then the politicians who are elected to represent those mud dwellers are going to be comfortable politicking in the mud as well. You can't have a culture that's as degraded and as coarse and as immoral as America's has become and expect that the political leaders are going to be any different than what the culture breeds. This is why we need in America to secure America's liberties, because it's only a moral people who can self-govern and who don't need a big government telling them what to do. To secure America's leaders, we need faith-based voters flooding the polls. And it's not enough just to vote and go home and then wait until the next election. There has to be an accountability factor. We need an active, thriving, faith-based community. First, flooding the polls, voting based on moral choices, voting based on biblical teachings, biblical principles, which sort of raises the question of how can any fine, upstanding member of the Christian community vote for candidates who are open advocates for abortion. But that's between those voters and God. But aside from a faith-based community flooding the polls and voting based on moral compasses that come from the Bible, we then need step 2, this same faith-based community staying alert and active to hold the politicians that they themselves elected accountable for their actions. We can't allow these politicians to go to Washington, D.C. and forget their faith-based community that backed them, that sent them to D.C. The evangelical vote, how big is it really? That is a piece from Jay Tolson, September 24th, 2008, in U.S. News. Polling data are muddled by issues of how to define this key voting bloc, he wrote back then, which is true. Evangelicals are classified in many different ways, and some pundits, some writers, some scholars, some analysts don't even like to use that term, evangelicals, because it is so broad. But for the purposes of just bringing forth another viewpoint into this podcast, he writes, evangelicals have been recognized as pivotal players in the American political landscape, at least since the election of President Jimmy Carter, as a vital component of the values voter bloc, along with conservative Roman Catholics. They are even credited with making the crucial difference in the 2004 presidential race. But assessing the precise role of evangelicals in elections is not easy, a study by 2 sociologists shows, because analysts and pollsters use quite different definitions to identify these voters and their movement. That's true. That's true, right? And then you have, in the Christian community, you have different voting blocs broken down by things like race and other demographics. You have Black Christians that by and large vote Democrat a lot more than white Christians. But still, this piece asks, so should we simply ignore all that polling data about evangelicals? No, the 2 authors, the 2 sociologists who wrote the report say, but we should be aware of how different types of polls go about studying them. Religion in Public broke it down by different segments of Christian society in a March 2021 piece called The 2020 Vote for President by Religious Groups, Christians. And it primarily just focused on the data. It broke down the data, the different voting blocs among the faith-based community of voters. And it's interesting when you account for race in the faith-based community. In 2008, 35.4% of non-white evangelicals voted Republican versus 64.3% non-white evangelicals voting Democrat. In 2012, it was 31.4% non-white evangelicals voting Republican versus 67.9% voting Democrat. In 2016, it was 31.9% for Republican versus 62.5% for Democrat, and a larger share than in the previous two elections, 5.5% of non-white evangelicals in 2016 voting for a third-party candidate. And then in 2020, it was 33.7% non-white evangelicals voting Republican versus 64.7% non-white evangelicals voting Democrat. Just an item of interest, because it just seems like a lot of times Christians or the Christian community or evangelicals or the faith-based community all gets lumped together in this big voting bloc. And really, if you peel back the layers of the onion that makes up the Christian or faith-based community in America, there are very big differences in how these faith-based voters actually cast their ballots. That being said, it cannot be emphasized enough that the key to securing American liberties, both now and forever after, rely on the powerful voice of the faith-based community of voters in America. Because even allow for differences among non-white evangelicals versus white evangelicals. Allowing for differences, there is still a common denominator there, that all these evangelicals, so labeled, so dubbed evangelicals, white and non-white, at least recognize the authority of a higher power at work. And it's that higher power, that accountability to a higher power, that in the end keeps a limited government structure in place in America, which is what Founding Fathers wanted for us, which is what Founding Fathers gifted to us. It's only those who believe that one day they will be accountable for their actions on earth to another authority, to a higher authority, to God. It's only those people who are able to rein in their immoral impulses, their fleshly impulses, and behave in a way that does not require an outside force, a big government force, a law enforcement force, to tell them that their behaviors are right or wrong, because they know they take their behavior standards from a higher power who does not change. And so one group that has seen great success in its ranks in recent times, especially, and that is a driving force of faith-based voters in America, is called the Faith and Freedom Coalition. And they just wrapped up their annual Road to Majority conference. It was called Road to Majority 2022. It was held in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm happy to say that Executive Director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, Timothy Head, is here on Bold and Blunt to talk about some of the outcomes from this conference and hopefully inspire you as a listener, as a faith-based listener, I assume, to get more active and involved in the political realm. Timothy Head, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
So your organization just wrapped its annual Road to Majority conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and I wanted to discuss some of the themes that came out of that conference that really energized your base. What's looking as the big trend in the coming midterms?
Well, at the conference itself, which was held before the Supreme Court opinion had been released on overturning Roe versus Wade, there was a lot of anticipation about that, but of course nobody knew specifically how that was going to come down quite yet. So a lot of discussion about the kind of the fruits of the labor, if you will, of constituting this new Supreme Court. But that hope has now been realized.
Right.
But I think that was a major galvanizing force. I think we had a couple thousand people in attendance, and that was both on stage and then also kind of just in the hallways of the hotel throughout the week. A lot of people were very encouraged by that. I think another piece, it's a bit of a push-pull effect. A lot of people are certainly frustrated by the status of the American economy, but also felt like that's a major political opportunity, of course, for conservatives, as clearly a lot of people are not seeing much hope or reason for hope from the way the Biden administration has handled economic issues right now. And then I think another piece that's maybe a little more on the cultural side, you could say, two significant kind of responses in recent times by less liberal people, we'll call them, the DeSantis Florida legislative kind of pushback on Disney. I think it's really galvanized a lot of Christians have been very discouraged by corporate wokeism or corporate activism for the last several years. So I think there's actually a lot of kind of wins on the board, so to speak. It's not just kind of this kind of pie in the sky stuff. It's real optimism.
Let's talk about that pushback Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida is doing against Disney for a moment, because that is huge. And I just wonder, since you are on the top of the cultural fight in America and on the inside, do you see those type of pushbacks against woke corporatism, especially woke corporatism that goes after our children and exploits our youth? Do you see that being copycatted in other states led by Republican governors?
As a matter of fact, I do, on a couple of fronts. So this is not being publicized quite yet, but I think a piece that a lot of people are going to be hearing more about in the Texas Senate is actually about to begin hearings in the month of July with 6 largest investment firms in the country to basically to ask them on what exactly what their ESG, which is the environmental, social, and governance policy on their own investment portfolios are, because they also handle a lot of investment for the state of Texas, right? It's for retired teachers, retired state employees, etc. And Texas wants to know, if you're going to use our money, from Texas legislators, are you going to use our money against us in our own kind of either environmental or social policies that Texas wants to continue with? And so this will be, I think, a second huge swath of conversations that really, to date, we haven't seen huge movement like this from generally, obviously, Republicans are more business friendly and corporate friendly, but as corporations are choosing to be more activists, and for that matter, more maybe we'll call it coastal, West Coast, East Coast, in its kind of social and environmental perspectives. A lot of Southeast and kind of Middle America states are saying, if you want to do business, that's great, but if you're going to preach at us, we got other options out here.
That is huge. That is significant. And I guess detail for listeners how that would work. So if corporations are handling state workers' pension funds, is that it? That the state would fight back and not allow those corporations to do business any longer?
So these are bids that are awarded by state of, every state has the equivalent of a retired state employees and retired teachers, and there's some other maybe university
Right.
But they're awarded to large investment firms, right? So the huge banks and the huge hedge funds and venture capital and private equity and so if you were talking about, for instance, BlackRock, which is the largest wealth management fund on the planet, I think close to $10 trillion under management.
That is friendly with China.
Texas would say, well, if you want, those two funds, the retirement and the educators funds for Texas are I think between the two of them, maybe $12 or $13 billion. If you want to manage those funds, we need to know, because obviously a huge part of Texas's portfolio or economy is fossil fuels. So if you're going to be an activist fund against fossil fuels or for alternative fuels, Texas wants to know that. So they'll be inclined to award their the $13 billion of management to funds that are not actually going to actively hurt the Texas economy.
With BlackRock being one of the key firms that is friendly with China, for people who don't realize that, correct?
Correct, yeah. So, look, these enormous funds are global. Obviously, if you're talking about BlackRock, again, $10 trillion in assets, but a lot of these become global funds, and they're going to have to kind of choose. Do you want to, if you're want to handle public funds, and in that case, Texas funds, you're going to have to choose, which is your priority. Are you going to pursue, sometimes those interests really do compete with each other, and Texas has said, we're not just going to throw in just purely because of your percentage returns anymore.
Well, that is great news, and I would love to know that other Republican governors in Republican-dominated states take the same steps as Texas seems to be taking. That you just gave us a heads up on. Thank you for that. That is great news. Your speaker.
So, if we see Florida take action and we see Texas take action, I actually think that it increases the likelihood that you can see another 24 to 26 states do the same.
Wow. Some pushback finally from, that's really great news from these ESG goals. This great reset type plan would have crippled America's capitalistic system. So we need Republicans to stand strong up against this.
Absolutely. I think that as far as environmental things go, I do think that, of course, it's entirely responsible and can be profitable to have smart and diversified portfolios. But whenever you start to wage war on a sector of the American economy, that's where you kind of have flipped the script on people, I think.
Now, you at this Road to Majority 2022 in Nashville, you guys had some great speakers, not only President Trump with the keynote address, but Mike Pompeo, Newt Gingrich, Senator Blackburn, Congressman Jim Jordan. What was this theme that came out of some of these speakers going forward? What are they talking about in terms of trends for America, the next fight?
Sure. The federal elected officials, are clearly, Jim Jordan and the members of the Senate. We had Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham and Rick Scott, for that matter. They're clearly focused on the fall and 2022, and so I think that's kind of front and center for the federal elected officials, and then the state elected officials are focusing, of course, on elective results in November, but trying to kind of push back in various states, against the drift or sort of the languishing of Washington D.C. right now. So I think Mark Robinson, Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, spoke very compellingly about we needed states like North Carolina and Florida, Texas, Tennessee, et cetera, to really be a stark contrast to Washington, D.C., and not just a different shade of gray.
I would like to say that, especially given the recent Supreme Court decisions that have ruled in favor of sanity on religious freedom from Coach Kennedy, on gun rights and the Second Amendment about the New York case, and of course on Roe v. Wade, that this nation has taken a decided step back toward Christian conservative principles. And then come polls like the one we just saw, I think it was from Gallup, showing that fewer Americans historically than ever before believe in God. That goes along with the polls we've seen in recent times about fewer Americans going to church. So where do you fall on optimism for America in terms of returning to strong conservative constitutional ideals and the idea that rights come from God, not government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a fair question. And a lot of people, kind of maybe look out the window of wherever their local community is, or nationally, and it looks like there's a bit of a spiral going on. And then when we see reports like the Gallup poll that you just alluded to, I actually was a minister before I worked in policy, and I think my general take is this. I think that, first of all, America obviously is growing and diversifying. So when they started that poll, 80 plus years ago, it was a somewhat diverse but more monolithic, homogenous country. 330 million people live here now, and tons of immigration, and we love immigration. But that's going to bring, differing thought than we used to see. But I also think that we're also seeing kind of fewer nominal believers. So people that kind of, maybe they go to church on Christmas and Easter, but the rest of the time, rest of the year, they're sleeping in on Sundays or not attending Mass or whatever the case. And so I actually think that kind of that the divergence is it may be that Gallup, the respondents to Gallup and other pollsters, they're just, maybe being a little more honest and stark in their own reporting, because I think that a lot of people in 1940s thought, well, the answer is supposed to be yes, because my mom told me so. And these days, you kind of see less of that. But I also think, interestingly, the number of there actually is church growth in certain sectors, for instance, of the Christian denomination. So I would say kind of like what you might think of as just sort of kind of milquetoast kind of doctrine or theology, the kinds of denominations and teachings. They don't really compel people anymore, but what I would consider more biblically orthodox, strong biblical teaching actually resonates and moves or motivates people even more than it used to. So I'd say that kind of middle ground is shrinking, and people that may not have had a very strong faith or maybe any at all feel more comfortable saying that, and people that have strong faith are also more vocal in that faith. And we even saw that reflected in the 2020 election when more people of faith voted than we've ever seen before. So there's kind of these two vectors are almost kind of moving in opposite directions. More people are saying they don't believe, but the people who do believe are actually more vocal and active than ever before.
And just as another quick standard of measurement, how has been your attendee and participation numbers at Faith and Freedom Coalition's annual conferences? Are they on the upswing? Are they leveling off?
They are. Yeah, we've seen. So interestingly, we've done our conference now for 13 years. Not a terribly old organization, and the first 10 were in Washington D.C. Because of COVID, we've moved it outside of D.C. for the last 3 years, and we've seen a steady uptick of those numbers. So I would say over the last really 5 years, in particular, we've seen about 10 or 15% growth, sometimes 20% growth each year. So, I think that, organizationally from us, and then also as we kind of move to other parts of the country outside of Washington, D.C., we're seeing a little bit bigger crowds and a little more energetic crowds. So believe it or not, it's I think, from our kind of perch in the world, we actually see a lot of room for optimism and for hope as we move forward, not only numerically in crowds, but also in the results like we've been talking about today.
Well, I take that as a note of optimism, because it tells me that Americans are becoming more awakened to the crucial need to bring religion and politics together, not in a way that church rules, but in a way that founding fathers envisioned and wanted for America.
I couldn't agree more. That conversation, maybe for another day, we can talk about that kind of church-state separation, quote unquote. Of course, that language isn't in the Constitution, but the concept is to keep government out of the church, not keep faith or religion out of government, because we all, whether we call ourselves Christian or any other organized religion or an unbelieving person, we all bring worldviews, perspectives, convictions, and of course it's ridiculous to suggest that citizens aren't going to act politically around their own convictions and worldviews. So we actually consider this it's a great time, I think, for lively debate. And one of the reasons why we so believe that the First Amendment is such a seminal bedrock for really a healthy democracy.
Just to wrap, I just want to give you a quick opportunity to mention when your next Faith and Freedom Coalition event is, if people want to attend.
Well, you can always follow us on our website at ffcoalition.com. The summertime after the conference, we'll slow down and let people have vacations and get kids back at school. But we'll pick up in the fall, in September and October. We're planning several smaller events in states across the country. So we'll probably have 7 or 8 events in Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, Texas, Iowa, probably one on the West Coast, maybe in Southern California in September and October, around kind of as we move into election phase. But check out ffcoalition.com, and we'll give updates on that on a regular basis.
Excellent. Faith and Freedom Coalition. I love the group. Timothy Head, thank you so much for what you do for America and for being on Bold and Blunt.
Well, yeah, we thank you so much for having us, and God bless y'all.
God bless. Well, a quote comes to mind to sort of summarize this discussion, a quote I'm sure you've heard of before. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. So where do you stand on that scale? Hopefully, you're all about fighting the evil. Thank you for listening. I want to remind that you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, or wherever podcasts are offered. And you can also pick up a copy of my latest book, Locked Down, The Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom, at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, and anywhere books are offered. I appreciate your support. Thank you so much for listening. Tune in next time, and don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.